so much for coming to our inaugural roundtable, which has been convened by artist Cian Dayrit on the occasion of his exhibition, which opened here last week at Venice Artist Projects. So, more than providing answers, I think tonight this roundtable will provoke questions. Unfortunately, Marian Pastor Roces is quite ill and couldn't join us at the last minute, but I'm very thrilled to have Victor Paz and Aya Santos and all of you here with us tonight for this discussion. So our topic is twofold. We're going to be discussing ethics and issues around cultural appropriation, which, as we know, happens all the time, from food, music, dance, art, language. Cultural dialogue and exchange expands creative horizons, but the problems lie in underlying inequality in the world. So who benefits from this form of exchange? What are the ethics around it? Are people being used, or what are these imbalances of power? So recently there was an incident at New York at the Whitney Museum where painter Dana Schutz was, I guess, publicly vilified by another artist, Hannah Black, for a painting that she made of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old African-American who was murdered and lynched in 1955. At the time, his mother, she wanted the publications of his mutilated body, or she wanted the photographs of his mutilated body to proliferate in the media, and it became a very important part of the civil rights movement. What wasn't very public was actually while there was a call against this, it was because Dana Schutz was white, and Hannah Black felt that as a white person, she was benefiting from the trauma of African Americans. There was another work of a very similar subject by an African American artist, which didn't receive any criticism, but this opened up a global dialogue as to who is able to talk about what. Another incident recently, Jimmy Durham, an artist who's known in Europe mostly as being a Cherokee artist, was recently called out by the Cherokee community for not being a Cherokee artist, and there was a call to remove the work. That there's other issues around that. Sam Durant, another artist, in 2012, a documenta showed a work which was a sculpture of gallows. When that work was moved to the Walker Sculpture Park this year in 2017, there was a huge outcry because those gallows actually referenced gallows that were used to murder people from the Dakota community in that area. They took the work down, gave it to the Dakota community who were considering whether they want to burn it or not. But again, one thing that's very important in all of this is context, which we will discuss later. To quote a recent article from Art Review, Kenan Malik's words, cultural interaction isn't necessarily messy because the world is messy. Some of the messiness is good, the complexity and diversity of the world. Some of it is damaging, the racial, sexual, and economic inequalities that disfigure our world. Such damaging messiness will not be cleaned up by limiting cultural interaction or by confining it within a particular etiquette. In reframing political and economic issues as cultural ones, or issues of identity, campaigns against cultural appropriation obscure the roots of racism and make it harder to challenge it. In constraining what Adam Schatz has called acts of radical sympathy and imaginative identification across racial lines, they make such challenges more difficult still. The campaigns against cultural appropriation are bad for creative art. They are bad for progressive politics. They seek to police interaction and constrain imagination. For the sake of both art and politics, we need less policing and constraints and more interaction and imagination. So this is Kenan's opinion, and we can discuss this later. Moving into the second topic of the panel, which is the ethics and responsibility of representing Indigenous knowledges, I'll quote my colleague Katja Garcia Anton from the Office for Contemporary Art in Norway. Something that's, I guess, trendy in the art world right now is exhibiting Indigenous artists. And it has been done, I would say the Venice Biennale did it very badly. There was a program called the Pavilion of Shamans, where there was a tribe from the Amazon who was brought up doing a spiritual dance within a contemporary art context that felt very much like a human zoo. It was, I think that there are appropriate ways of engaging with Indigenous cultures in the art world, and there are inappropriate ways as well. To quote Katya, the so-called indigenization of the global art world is much referred to, as artistic and other creative voices from Indigenous communities are increasingly sought after for exhibitions, festivals, biennials, and art fairs, especially as museums race to consider the globalness of their museological practices. Within this context, cultural workers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, are facing the challenge of engaging meaningfully and ethically with history, present and future, of Indigenous arts and thoughts. So within the framework of Cian's exhibition, this roundtable is bringing together practitioners working with Indigenous communities in the Philippines, and we seek to create a basis to consider the ethics and responsibility of appropriating the culture of approximately 370 million Indigenous peoples on the planet who belong to 5,000 different groups in 90 countries worldwide. My role as the moderator is to be neutral and to facilitate a meaningful dialogue here with our esteemed panelists tonight. Cian is also here. If anyone has any questions, he's just said hello in the back. But one personal thing that I will share is that I actually am of Indigenous origin. My mother is Chamorro from Guam, but I do not feel comfortable representing Indigenous specific cultures because the values with which I live my way of life, which are very career-driven and individualistic, are completely at odds with the communal values of that community. However, on the other side, I run the world's largest South Asian art festival, and while I don't have any South Asian ethnic heritage, I do feel comfortable speaking and working with those communities because of the time that I have spent with them and the engagement that I've had. So I think this is a very challenging and hot topics, and I look forward to discussing it with our panelists. To introduce our first speaker, Aya Santos. She is the Public Information Officer of Sandugo, Alliance and Movement of Moro and Indigenous Peoples in the Philippines for Self-Determination and National Liberation. Sandugo, as the movement is called, unites the national minorities of the Philippines, which represent 15% of the Filipino population, in their collective struggle for the rights to self-determination and just peace. Prior to this, Santos was the Secretary General of Families of Desaparecidos for Justice, the Alliance for the Advancement of People's Rights, and a paralegal worker. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, good evening. I'm just gonna open my presentation. I didn't know that we were gonna use my laptop, but we can wait, I'll just I think I gave you the file. I think it's there. I don't know if it's. Yes. There's just. Okay. Hi, good evening. I'm Aya. I'm from Sandugo, the movement of Moro and Indigenous peoples for self-determination. I guess you're wondering why we're including the Moro peoples with the Indigenous peoples. We call them the national minorities. We're fighting for the right of the national minorities for self-determination. Self-determination for the Indigenous peoples and the Moro, as we call them, the national minorities, is the right to be able to dictate and to be able to direct their lives as communities without any pressure or without any dictates by any oppressive state or any oppressive government. Okay, so this is my presentation for tonight. I'm aware I'm given 10 minutes, right? So, the Indigenous peoples, there are more than 100 ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines. We're still counting the exact number of ethno-linguistic groups right now. There are some who have been out of their communities through diaspora because they had to look for some livelihood, or maybe they were displaced by some mining companies, or maybe they were displaced by some big agro corporation or plantations that took their ancestral lands. 16%, they comprise 16% of the population here in the Philippines. That's just the indigenous peoples. The Moro people, or the Bangsamoro, at least they have 5% in the population of the whole Philippines. Most of them are in the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, and many have been here in Metro Manila. We also have to tackle the long history of minorization and national oppression that is being experienced by the indigenous peoples and the Moro peoples. That would mean we'd have to go way back in the colonization period. That would mean the Spanish period and the American period, even the Japanese occupation. It is through their struggle, and it is through their effort to fight against the colonialists that they were able to at least preserve not entirely their whole culture or their whole identity, but at least they were able to maintain many aspects of their culture, their livelihood, their ways of life. That's why they still exist until now. Even after the occupation period or colonialization, they still experience national oppression. That would mean that they continue to be displaced in their ancestral lands. They continue to suffer poverty. They continue to suffer from the lack of access to education, health services, even the services of the government that they should be receiving from the social work, Department of Social Work. And of course, national minorities suffer harsher poverty conditions, marginalization, and exclusion. I know that the majority of the Filipinos know very well what it's like to be poor. We know the slums, the urban poor communities here in Manila. But if they, the harder the life in the urban poor communities, it's even harder in the lives of the national minorities. Okay, so in the current situation of the national minorities here in our country, it is brought mostly by the foreign and corporate plunder. Indigenous peoples, their land, their lives, and future are being ruined to give way to large-scale mining, agribusinesses and plantations, large energy infrastructure projects, and so-called forestry programs. We know what happened to the Tampakan mining. Have you heard that there was a massacre in Tampakan? The Lumat areas in Mindanao suffered many massacre or murder. We used to call them extrajudicial killings in Karapatan. Karapatan is the non-government organization that documents human rights violations. And when we see large-scale mining in one area, there's always human rights violations that are being documented in the area of large-scale minings. If you've heard about the Campbell massacre, where a pregnant woman, Judy Capion, and two of her sons, John Mark and Jason Capion, was massacred, and the military said as an excuse that it was a legitimate encounter between the military and the New People's Army. But if the fact-finding mission says that the boys were already in their uniform, white uniform, and it was broad daylight, or when the military came and sprayed bullets in their house. Why? Because their father was one of the leaders of the community who was struggling and fighting against the SMI, Extrata company. I don't know if you've heard about that company, who's doing exploration in that area. And they don't want the exploration in their community because that would mean displacement. And taking land away from the indigenous peoples, that would mean taking their identity, taking their culture away from them. Because they would have to go to the urban centers to find some job. Agribusinesses and plantations. Right now, more than half of Mindanao is being committed by the government for palm oil plantation. And most of these lands are lumad areas and even moral lands. So where will the lumad people, the lumad will go? They can be the workers in the plantation, but they won't be able to own the land. And if the plantation, if the palm oil contract expires, the land will not be able to, it's not going to be fertile anymore. That's why in some countries, palm oil is being banned or campaigned for banning the palm oil plantation because it destroys the diversity, it destroys the land. You cannot use the land anymore if you use palm oil in vast lands. Large energy infrastructure projects. Philippines is the most rich in water resources because we're an archipelago. So why do we need mega dams? The communities, the lumad communities, even the majority of the communities in our provinces, they have the capacity to build their own renewable energy systems. It's community-based. But many of the corporations would build big energy projects in many areas. Why? It's not because to give light or to give energy to the small communities. Because of the big projects of big corporations that would need large amount of energy. And if we see in the communities the big coal plantations or the big energy projects, the small communities surrounding that project wouldn't even have their own energy or wouldn't have their own electricity. They would have to buy. And the so-called forestry programs. The National Greening Program, we have been interviewing many of the lumad and actually even the Aita in the Central Luzon say that many of the projects, the National Greening Program, is the new phase of land grabbing in their communities. It sounds nice, National Greening Program, but if you'd be able to read what's inside the National Greening Program, the program would mean encouraging you to plant, but not just any plant. They would want you to plant fruit-bearing trees that's commercialized, not for the communities to have their own livelihood, or not for the communities to be able to have food, but for them to be able to sell it, to bigger companies and to export it. And who are the victims of this? Mostly the indigenous peoples. So it's because of these continuing attacks on, and I don't know if you have heard the recent case of massacre against the Diliman. It happened just last week. The Tiboli and the Dulangan Manobo in Lake Cebu, there was a massacre of 8 Diliman, perpetrated by the 27th Infantry Battalion and the 33rd Infantry Battalion, because the Diliman reclaimed their ancestral land in Lake Cebu, North Cotabato. It was before tried to be taken by a big company, if I may mention, the DMCI Incorporated, and because they were able to reclaim that their ancestral land, at least just a portion of it, they were able to plant their own crops. Before, it was the company planted coffee for Nestle. They can't eat coffee, of course. And then they can't have coffee every day or every hour in their lives. So they plant sustainable crops. They plant food for them to be able to eat it. They don't need cash crops. They just need crops for them to be able to eat. So they planted those sustenance crops, those plants, and then right after the president said that he is announcing that the New People's Army and the Communist Party of the Philippines are now considered as terrorists, the next day, the military came to their community and then sprayed bullets to many houses, killing 8 Diliman. One of them is a datu. That would mean the chief of their tribe, and 2 of the members, two of his sons were killed with that. Actually, the relatives, some of the relatives, have already come here in Manila to tell their story. I hope you would be able to hear them. We will make a lot of effort to make their voices be heard. So, because of these intensifying attacks, the indigenous peoples and the Moro and the Bangsamoro, they were able to unite and spark a movement to defend their land identity and the right to self-determination, and in pursuit for national determination. That's why, I don't know if you've heard about the Lakbayan. It's one of the campaigns of the Sandugo, that many indigenous peoples groups from Cordillera and down from the south, from Mindanao, they would come here and converge and then make a camp for at least several days and then make their voices heard. They would make activities, cultural activities. They would go to schools. They would go to many institutions for them just to tell their story or to steer discussions. What's self-determination? What's land grabbing? What's ancestral land for them? And what does it mean to take their ancestral lands? So those are one of the protests that Sandugo made. So this is during the APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation here in Manila in 2015. And then in 2016, Sandugo was formally formed. So their advocacy is the rights of the national minorities for self-determination, ancestral lands and territories. We include territories because the Moro, they don't say they have their own ancestral lands. They say it's their territories. The right to access to social welfare such as health and education. Have you heard about the schools of the Diliman being threatened to be bombed in Mindanao? Imagine that the Diliman, they don't have access to education for so long. And then they realize that they need education. They can't go every day going down to the mountain and tell their children, go down to the mountain every day just to go to school. So what they did, it's self-help school. They asked help so that they could make schools out of their own bare hands. And then encourage teachers they won't be able to pay their teachers, but their teachers are volunteer teachers. Because they want their children to have a better future. But now it's being threatened to be bombed and they have to evacuate. And the rest of the story goes on because the schools being interrupted, the children are in the evacuation centers. So that's the latest 2017 Lakbayan ng Pambansang Memoria. The students, the Diliman students were here in UP Manila. They were telling their stories, and you know what they wanted when they grow up? They just wanted to be teachers. They don't want to be the big, hotshot scientists or the skyrocket engineers. They just want to be teachers. Why? They just want to pass the education that they have attained. Why? So that the next generation would be able to develop also their lives, their community, and even their agriculture, and for them to be able to know their rights and be able to defend them. Okay, so one of the advocates is right to affiliate themselves to organizations and practice religion of their choice without being discriminated. This is especially for the Moro, especially now, in our current situation, and the right for the Bangsamoro to secede from a very oppressive government. Okay. So that's the current situation, and that's Sandugo. Please like us on Facebook. And check our website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aya, for sharing this all with us, and we'll pick up on this more later. We're going to go back in time now with our next speaker, Victor Paz. Victor is a professor at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He specializes in archaeobotany, island of Southeast Asian archaeology, public archaeology, and the materiality of consciousness. Paz boasts an impressive list of publications. His most recent include Implication of Pathological Changes in Cremated Human Remains in the Routledge Handbook of Bioarchaeology in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, Mobility of Early Islanders in the Philippines during the Terminal Pleistocene, Early Holocene Boundary, PXRF Analysis of Obsidian Artifacts in the Journal of Archaeological Science, and a string of Ling Ling around the Middle Sea, published in Thai string around the world. He completed a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts degrees in history at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Moreover, he holds a PhD and MPhil in archaeology from the University of Cambridge. His current projects include the Palawan Island Paleo-Historic Project, the Katanawan Archaeology and Heritage Project, the Bala Archaeology and Heritage Research Project, and the Agusan del Sur Archaeology and Heritage Research Project. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much. How do I project this? That's right. Good evening, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. Good evening. Delighted to be here because of Cian. I'm also usually shy. coming at. But the reason why Cian Dayrit, the artist, whose wonderful exhibit is just next door, is known to us in the archaeology community because for several years he has been collaborating with our community with his several installation art, and then he reciprocates by, well, parking some of his artwork in our library at the Archaeological Studies program. I see him always as a deep-thinking artist who doesn't know how to draw mold or anything, but amazing ideas. And this is the latest addition to his long list of creative work, and more will come. But he's always very controversial. He likes this controversial part. And maybe that's why it's very interesting. It has been said earlier on, the tone, that we want to address two things in this discussion. The question of appropriation and the question of ethics of using images, objects, material culture in our parlance from indigenous communities. Let me start by saying that when we talk of indigenous community in the Philippines, well, practically all ethno-linguistic groups are indigenous. It's a question, I think Sandugo will agree, of whether you are a minority community or are you a majority indigenous community. And that's also historical. As mentioned by Aya, a lot of the minority indigenous communities are the ones that are marginalized by the minority. Usually they manage to keep hold of a lot of their culture that is not heavily laden by Judeo-Christian imagery and practices, but they were never isolated. And they were treated always as indigenous for a long time, minority, and even the Americans celebrated it, romanticized it. These are people that they're the noble savages that should be preserved, that's what do you call this, Neil Worcester talking in the height of the beginning of the American period. And the majority are the ones who were Christianized in the lowlands, etc. Now, talking about appropriation, and this is wonderful in language, the word Moro and Igorot are very derogatory terms up to the 1970s. And then they were appropriated by liberation movements. And so the Moro National Liberation Front appropriated a very negative term into a positive term for the indigenous groups, for what we now call the Lumans, or the indigenous minorities of Mindanao. And now Lumad is appropriated across the entire nation. So even Igorots can call themselves interchangeable with Lumad. Second point there is Igorot. Very derogatory to talk about all the indigenous groups living in the Cordillera Mountains. But now it is again appropriated as a positive language. So the two things that I like to take this, again, focusing on the materiality of culture, from my own study and hobby horse, I try to write this crazy book, but I always like every opportunity to air it. So what my hopeful contribution to the discourse, to the dialogue, is perhaps to put a bit of angle that covers a big chunk of time. And because I take a big chunk of time, do forgive me if it doesn't seem to be too focused or too sensitive to the plights of current indigenous groups. Because I see it two ways all the time. Where is it? And maybe it's in the ethics now that we're probably get into that in the discussion. But I will try to focus first so that I give you an explanation when I give my contributions or my discussion points when we open it to everyone again in the discussion. So, in my studies, it all comes down to two major questions I was asked. How can we really learn more about what happened to past cultures? And how are they connected to the current culture? Once you try to connect it to current culture, we call that heritage. And in the realm of heritage, that is where all of this is really playing on. The second major question that I always ask myself, and leads me to these answers or attempts to answer it, is that is it possible for us to get into the consciousness, to the thinking of people in the past? And because I'm a Filipino and live in this island, in this archipelago, I want to see how much of that past is connected to the current thinking or the current consciousness. I will start by saying fact on that we hardly really have articulated or united in an articulation of who we are as Pinoys. And that's where the problem lies. I don't know about the Chamorros, but I think the Chamorros also have that same dilemma. Many people have articulated, but it hasn't really gone to a point where everyone can be very comfortable in the explanation of who we are. And that becomes a problem. And that's why we have this discourse and disconnect in trying to identify us and unfortunately get into the quarrel of otherness, where inside us we think that we are different from the other ethno-linguistic group who have all the same experience. The Cebuano saying that Manila and the Imperial Manila and those Tagalogs and saying those Kapampangans and everyone trying to make the other ethno-linguistic group the other. The difference with what we call the indigenous minority, the state in this way, it's, even in colonial American first half of the century, they had a bureau for minorities. And then in the early days of the Republic after the war, the independence, they also had that kind of bureau. And then later on, we have now the NCIP. And then the laws are now out there to help the indigenous minority communities. The unexpected result of this, when before it was easier to count the number of indigenous communities, which were given the authority, the power, and the right to get hold, as long as they can define it, who they are, and their land, their ancestral domain, then they have rights over those lands. And because of that, it became very profitable for people to subdivide themselves from the larger group and declare themselves an independent indigenous community. And that's to take advantage of this kind of law, and makes the issue more complicated. Now, like I said, if you're studying contemporary cultures, it's easy to get to the agent, you can even name them, and the agency of human groups in the transformation of cultures. You can get to the collective consciousness if you study it well and are a part of the community. And like I said, even like Cian is not an Agta, but Cian is a Filipino, and then speaking a lingua franca that everyone understands, it was easy for him to do that and immediately get a grip of what is happening with the Agda groups living around that Bataan, the foothills of the Zambales range. Now, the collective unconscious of the mind, that's more difficult, but I'm interested in that, and I will tell you more about it. Now, if you take it from the past, archaeologically, and you're talking about 1,000 years ago, even 500 years ago, or 2,000, the lower, deeper down in time you go, it becomes more difficult. But like I said, I'm interested in that, and interested to see how far the wet roots of connections between us now and the deep past, because I think that is the way to understand it. And so, I became a fan of Jung, because I said, my God, this is great, the collective unconscious, so different from Freud. And this is a concept that Freud didn't have. But of course, Jung was quasi-materialist, quasi-metaphysical. And so, maybe, but the idea is so not really out of the world, because years later, we started claiming that we all came from Africa. So if all modern humans came from Africa, then there is a primordial culture somewhere. Correct, right? If it's true. But that is the current dominant hypothesis now, that all modern humans came from Africa. So he may be not too far off, correct? So, just for those who are not aware of the collective conscious concept, it is those things that that somehow persist in a community, and in my understanding of it, these are the discarded archetypes of a culture. And archetypes are concepts that cultures don't want to forget. You don't want to forget your mother, your father. You don't want to forget the evil that's around you. You don't want to forget a hero or a concept of hero. And I found this in the web. It was just interesting. Archetypes across, based on Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, just to show you that there are so many archetypes that's out there that cultures don't want to forget. But cultures change, and once it's changed, it's like those furniture that is on top of the Baikubo, and then it will go down to the silo, or out in the garage, right? It is not totally discarded, but it takes a peripheral space in the consciousness or in the conscience of people. So that is what is the collective unconsciousness. I like that. And then, because of this very clever guy that I always talk to, Rafi Guliaco, who was interested in artificial intelligence, he said, hey look, there's some science now supporting it, coming from behavioral science and physics, that really put the materiality over what we call, what could you be calling the collective consciousness, unconscious. And it's the neural networks that then tells us really there's physicality to this. And this is so hardcore science that it is the philosophy behind the advances that are the research in artificial intelligence. So the idea that people, communities, individuals can live on and carry some, what we now, I like to call collective mind, to veer away from the Jungian model, then, hey, there's something going on here. So this is more or less my framework. If you have the inverted triangle tells us the narrowing down of what we know as we go deep down in time. You have material culture in that square, you have the collective mind, Himalayan is consciousness, and all of that has materiality, and within that, you have the collective consciousness, which maybe we can get, maybe we not, but definitely we can get into the collective mind, I think, by the persistence of the patterns or of representation. And then the cultural archetypes, like I said, as you go through time, some of them carry on, most of them are discarded, especially when cosmologies change. And when they're discarded, they are still in the collective mind. And then there's a connection. They're all in the same geographic area, and cultures have come and gone and has transformed. We have now truly a connection between whatever past we have and the current culture. So why is this relevant as far as this discussion is concerned? Because then all throughout the process, appropriation takes place. And in that appropriation of water web, and then it is then the discourse comes in whether one feels that they are at a disadvantage or an advantage. That's what I think. But everyone is guilty or does appropriation, all of us. And maybe, depending on context, we know that one is rightly to assert, and but which brings us to ethics. What is the ethical, what is the right or wrong of this? Then I suppose, like anything else, is that you announce where you got it. Who were the original? Who were the original articulators of this form? Or you, as an artist, where did you get it? An old-fashioned rigor of academic discipline. What that is? It's citation. That is the ethical part there. Ownership is tricky. Ownership is tricky, I think. So, especially in the Philippine experience, where unlike in North America or in Australia, where the dominant culture really came from Europe, and really is different from the indigenous culture that was put aside. And so it is a stronger chest-beating guilt feeling for them to make all those laws to try to reverse the exploitation and the genocide that happened. I believe in the Philippines, we did not experience that. The Tagalog, the dominant, the Tagalog, Ilocanos, Visayas did not do a genocide as ethno-linguistic groups against the other. The state, as Sandugo has already pointed out, does that. But this is more a class analysis rather than an ethnicity analysis, if you ask me. So those, for me, have many similarities but are totally different. So we have to be very clear about that as far as I'm concerned. I have many slides of examples, but I will, I think, stop here. But just to show you, maybe just for fun, you see I have many for traffic, you know, if you're just or for examples of right, here you go. Okay, so archaeologically, we have known things and not so certain things that we know we can, and a lot of things that, what the hell is this thing? Especially if it's out of context. But I believe, in my book, it's a question of appropriate and inappropriate representation. Okay? And that's always debatable. So, take, for example, Rizal is always appropriate to represented like this. And as a mason, as a young man, in an overcoat, Campbell was right there, funny, in a very humorous way, discuss this. Then you have undressable fashion, always prim and determined, revolutionary, live out. But ironically, the only picture we have of him is a yappy, in a bow tie, formal photo picture, because he was working for the very upscale Tutuban Railway Company. Okay, Manny Pacquiao, appropriate, right? But maybe it's already appropriate for him to be a senator, etc. No? If I showed this about 5 years ago, people would be laughing. No? But now, people are just worried, I think. Appropriate, right? And I bet half of this group is now thinking, change the tab, take it out. You know? It's not very comfortable, right? Inappropriate. And this is something I think that an art exhibit, our friend Deo Cruz did it so well with this very inappropriate for many representation of a crucifix, but he was in your face and he had articulation about it. So there are things that are appropriate. Let me make this last example. 2,000 years ago, at the most, I think, Tagalogs they were not Tagalogs then yet. Indigenous groups that were in the Tagalog region found it so appropriate to make votive jars with sunburst, right, besides. 1,000 years later, traders were bringing in Tang Dynasty where a Chinese artisan painted that design, which is like an abstract kind of flower. When the local got it, he said, wow, for that local, it must be a sunburst. And it ended up as a votive offering or a great good. Another 500 years after, Ming Dynasty, blue and whites, and the artisan back in China, I want to draw a flower on a vase. It got here, ooh, this is another light. It is great, and then saw it appropriate to make it a grave offering, right? Because it is a sunburst. And then, ang things to the Philippine flag, you have this sunburst. On the sunburst topic, the Kapitipunan flags are sunburst, right? With a Baybayin Ka for the early ones. Why didn't we follow the Spanish flag, the imperial flag at that time? And then when we had our republic flag, the early World War, there was a sunburst with a nice smiley emoji, right? Now, to give it contrast, the more violent and long revolution of the Americans, they appropriated the Union Jack in their revolutionary flags. Why is that? Well, because the revolutionaries had cultural affinity with Europe. So different from the American Indians. That's my argument there. And was that appropriate or not? Is that proper appropriation? It's actually very ironic, right? And that was a longer, bloody revolution that they won at the end. Those are just some of the examples, many more, but never mind, let me stop there. Thank you very much, and let's hope we have a
Well, quickly before we open it up to the floor, because I know you all traveled long ways to get here, and even if it wasn't a long way, it was probably a long journey. One of the things I found very interesting from your presentation was where you were talking about the threat of monoculture from an agricultural perspective to the minorities that you're working with and representing. And something that I love about the word monoculture is that kind of play on words between agriculture and culture, and that idea of flattening something out where difference can't sprout and difference can't exist. And you can also look at that by Christianization that's happening within these indigenous cultures as well. So what I wanted to ask, I guess, both of you is, in the face of this, I think another word that came up with both of you was collaboration. When there's this collaboration or, a form of respect between two different cultures, there's a way to move forward. So something that I found very interesting working with Cian on this exhibition was that, Cian wanted to speak with the Aita communities and not. And something that he found during his research was, if you see these beautiful red-bound leather books, most of this research that had been done on the Aitas had actually never been shared back with them. So it was, kind of this relationship where you spend time with someone, you extract it, you take it, you circulate it, and you leave. So I guess my question is, how do you think artists can help, indigenous communities tell their stories in a way that is helpful? Dr. Paz, you just spoke about, the importance of citation, but citation isn't going to feed people just the way that coffee isn't going to feed people. I'll give an example on both sides. I recently came across an uncomfortable, inappropriate in one context situation where an artist came to Bangladesh to paint the shipyards. So the world's second largest shipbreaking yards are in Bangladesh, and there are horrible labor exploitations there. But this artist painting sell for over $1 million. So he painted this, showed it in Milan, wanted to come back and show it in Bangladesh, but to me that's completely inappropriate because of this lack of agency, because these funds wouldn't come back into the community. Then you have another example, and I really hope that someone in the Philippines can show this work. But there's an Indian artist named Amar Kanwar, and he has this long-term project called the Sovereign Forest, where he's working with indigenous communities in Orissa whose lands are being taken away by mining companies. So the same kind of stories you're telling, they happen in India as well. So he's actually set up a museum in the community. So while this work is shown in Documenta and in museums all over the world, it has a local base with the community. And so the idea is, if evidence is being flattened, and if you can't get evidence, can poetry be evidence? Can drawings be evidence? How do you create a new form of this? So I think, those are two examples in my book, but I would love to hear, how you think that artists can shift these balances of power in a way that's appropriate.
There have many been artists who have been involved in the struggle for the indigenous people's right to self-determination. During the Lakbayan, there have been at least a dozen of visual artists who came to the camps, they drew a mural, actually several murals, depicting the stories of the indigenous peoples. You're right about the collaboration. The collaboration would mean that the indigenous peoples will be telling their stories, and then the artists, those who have the eye for the details, and those who would be able to reach out for the bigger audience, to the majority, and would know what would call the majority their attention to discuss these issues of the indigenous peoples. I think it's the artist who would be able to come up with outputs that could actually reach the bigger audience. The mainstream media, it's hard to break through to the mainstream media if it's just the indigenous peoples who would be telling in their local languages or in their own colors about their stories. But if it's our artists who have this feel of what would be the majority, what would the feel of the majority, or what would take their attention, or what would tickle the imagination or the emotions of the bigger majority. I think that's their role. But one crucial thing is that I think it's important for the artists to be able to immerse themselves in those communities, in the indigenous people's communities, because they should be able to depict through their artworks the representation, the proper representation of their stories. Not just the culture, but the struggle of the indigenous peoples. Actually, their resistance to many many contravidas in their communities, and that would make the indigenous people feel that these artworks are also their own. Many songs have been written about it, and even the indigenous peoples are singing those songs because these are songs were written in the middle of some workshop with the indigenous peoples or with the Moros, and many of the artworks or the visual artists did these murals with the indigenous peoples. So there's a lot of the artists, I think, would be able to make. And I think one of the questions about this is, well, they say that it's the cultural appropriation. But I think one of the big questions is that if you make the art, who would benefit the art? Who largely benefits the art? Would it be the community? Or would it be the commercial culture? Or would it be the bigger corporations because they're producing some product that has some hint of indigenous color in it? So I think if we want to help these indigenous peoples, it should mainly answer the question that it would benefit mostly the indigenous peoples directly to the communities and to the advancement of their rights.
Okay. Now about maybe 15 years ago, I realized, 16 years ago, I did a lot of ethnography, 20 years or so. I ended up in archaeology because I felt so burdened by the problems of the basic communities that I've been engaged, trying to understand their culture and then the political problems, etc. So I ended up in archaeology, and I realized there's no way escaping. If you excavate in a site more than once, there's no way escaping the communities. And so then I had a road to Damascus, where a community was totally against us excavating because, well, the more wealthy part of the community, because they had such a bad experience with treasure hunters. And they were not, they tried to dig up their church without, it started as a health clinic. And then at night they were digging underneath the health clinic into the old church. And so then a year after we came. So it was so hard. And then I realized, well, why don't we just immediately show them what we excavated? So on the spot with Noel El Farol, another artist who likes installation art, we started to create at the end of excavation, an exhibit, morning, afternoon. It was wonderful. And then we curated it, and then we left it there. And you know what? The year after, when we came back to dig another site in Mindoro, our exhibit was locally curated, and they got their own money. They put a glass cover over our exhibit. And I said, oh my God, it works. And that became our exhibit. But again, as anything, you think that it's so easy. So we transferred to other places. And I said, we'll try to see what create the best practice, and then let others think of the big picture. Let's see what we can do at the local base. And so we've been digging Palawan now for the last 14 years. And I thought it would just take 2 years and all that, but it's the 14 we grew old there. And then I realized it's not that easy. But I am still a believer that something that we can contribute to the other advocacies to help alleviate, uplift the well-being of basic communities is this. If you just hit on the economics of it, those who will succeed, if you don't develop their sense of belonging to a place, the first thing they will do, they will move to Manila. They will move to the next big city and maybe go and visit the old town every now and then, spend a bit of Palawan pawn shop money or LBC some money, but that's it. If you lift their consciousness, and I mean by consciousness here, their sense of cultural consciousness rooted to where they live, then it will be like a domino. Then it will be sustainable. Then they will be the ones who will dictate what kind of museums, tourism, eco projects that will come up. They will protect their environment. They will protect their natural resources. You have to lift the consciousness. And so that's what we've been trying to do. But like I said, it's almost 2 decades, and we're just making a dent. And this is one tiny village of settlers from Panay Island living in Palawan. But what I realize is because people can appropriate whatever's around them, even though they're not well rooted to it, if they really think that they already belong to the place. A bad example, but unintentional, with all good intentions, as they say, the road to hell is paved with gold. And is when the state in 70 or in early day declared Lipon Point, where Davao Cable was dislocated, and to make it to protect it, so national. The local community was not very involved, and so to today they don't have a sense of belonging or protecting it because they don't see themselves as part of it. We only found out about it later on, about 4 years ago. And that's a revelation. That supports what I'm saying. Then you have, again, settlers in the Mindoro Island, Tagalogs, who just came there. So when we came there, we recorded all the folklore, all these church ruins, and the folklore goes, oh, they were all built in one night, and our church was the last one, then the sun was rising, so it wasn't complete. You know? Or a big Jesuit giant, cleavered it off, and made all these churches, but he got angry. So all this folklore. Because when they came, and people were asking, why are we have ruins? No, none of the original inhabitants were there anymore. The Mangyans were already up in the hills, right? And so they had to create or reinvent the stories of origin or explain these ruins. And that kind of appropriation happens all the time, especially for non-literate cultures, like the majority of our cultures. Looking at that site there, I'd like to show that as classic appropriation. Guadalupe, Immaculada Concepcion from Mexico, right? So that's where the apparition came, that converted the Aztecs, etc. When it came to us, it was a replica of the original painting, painted on the fabric made out of the fiber of cacti. And when it came to us, it was appropriate. Why? First, these are examples. The first two to the left, from the left, are the examples of Immaculate Conception done by Chinese artisans. It's obvious, right? Isn't that appropriation? May Virgin Mary Chinese, right? Is there a problem with that? No. And then you have the half moon that is so articulated at half moon, the waxing, waning, fertility. But look at the one on the very right. Does that look like a half moon to you? No, because in the collective mind of people, it was so appropriate to make it a horn. So to them, that's a horn. The Virgin Mary is a tao-tao. A motif that's from Nagaland to New Guinea, to the Sepik, is consistent. Represented, unarticulated most of the time, or if it's articulated, it's reinvented in recent time, like appropriated into the imagery of Judeo-Christianity. But you just go to Sulawesi, Tao-Tao, Carabao, etc., right? Then hooks, no? Classic, all the cosmological elements. Or Tao-Tao, sunburst, and no? Then later on, if you even have a bird, it's even better. These are things that, another one, no? That's from Sarawak. And then, that's from Naga. Village gates with Tao-Tao and horns, right? And then, which brings us to this wonderful slide of tattoo. As a hangover of the discussion we had with the issue about the tattooing of the affair. Right? But why is it that it is now appropriate for many people to have their tattoos when it was not appropriate in the 70s? And if you had a tattoo in the 70s, you are an ex-convict, right? In the eyes of middle class Pinoys. Tattoos are for the sigat, the village thugs in the 70s and the 60s. But now, everyone wants to have a tattoo. And of course, in the old days, those are tattoos that were appropriate. Take the boxer codex tattoo here. I remember as a young student, someone said those ones in the ass are flowers. Maybe that's not right. You just cut your half a dozen heads, and I want a flower in my butt. I mean, that doesn't work. Those are sunbursts. And now look at those geometric tattoos on his back. Oh, they're just because I like the style of geometric design. Come on, all these styles have meaning to the individual. Maybe meaning that he invents. Maybe one person said, yes, they look like flowers to me. But in general, the unarticulated fact of it, these are stylized forms that carried on in the collective mind. And we can see in stylistic studies of many forms that those geometric designs can be argued strongly as abstracts of serpents, of snakes, of dragons. Dragons, snakes, serpents are all the same. They're all serpents, right? And they represent an unarticulated cosmology in their body. But you add on as you make more progress in your what you call that, in your life, right? So the flatness of culture, I'm not afraid anymore, because culture is so resilient, and we think that it is flat. If you look at that, just because they're not wearing G-strings anymore, that doesn't make them less outclassed. They have appropriated the cultures from outside into their culture, and if they have the consciousness, they have no problem with that. When we were doing field work with the Antas of the Negritos, they saw us from afar at the end of the beach. They wear their shirts. When they become comfortable with us, then the ladies will take off their shirts and go topless. It's just because they're adjusting. But it doesn't take out the uniqueness of their culture.
Okay, I'll leave this with two things before opening up to the floor, because we've been talking for over an hour now.
Very talkative.
Yeah, no, but very good talkative. So what I think is very interesting about, you know, how you're talking about the importance of keeping the consciousness and how the consciousness must be so rooted to the place. It's exactly the tool with which states are using to break this consciousness. So if you look at like the lost generation in Australia, where Aboriginal children were taken from their parents, sent into the cities, civilized, like, you know, there's one example. Or, you know, in the other context where I work in South Asia, just relocating different indigenous communities to the hill tract with which they have no, you know, they have no historical connection to. It's very interesting. So I think that is really a root if it's being used as a weapon and as a tool. And I guess another question I would have to is, I was in a Biennale recently where this tattooing was shown in an art context, which I felt very uncomfortable with. So imagine like live tattooing of a very sacred practice, as if it were kind of an event within an exhibition. So I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that. And the last thing I'll say, I guess, in terms of this sort of cultural appropriation is that the word in Chamorro for refrigerator is con ice, so with ice. So it's very interesting to see how languages change over time. So you have American and Spanish into the indigenous language at the moment. So, Cian, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you have any responses to what you just convened? Or thoughts? Questions?
It's actually a lot of things. I had sort of thought of having this conversation with you guys in particular, also with Marian Pastor Roces, who's not present here.
Yeah, it's not. She would have been the perfect pin.
Yeah, but then sort of composing this this discussion. I can't exactly say orchestrating a discussion because you cannot do that. But then I was interested in talking about the ins and outs of work within maybe the academe or cultural work or organization in the context of mass organization, and how that works in terms of how to deal with indigenous knowledge and how this idea of indigenous knowledge is materialized. So I thought we cannot just talk about indigenous knowledge without talking about indigenous struggle. And in between this talking about indigenous knowledge and indigenous struggle, where does appropriation fit in? And what we all do in terms of pitching into this narrative of appropriation. So I'm also I'm just waiting on the audience as well to sort of ask questions. Okay, good.
Professor Paz said disconnect is a root of otherness, no, Cian? I wonder what your position on this issue is and how did you address it in your art project? Okay, connected to that, maybe you would want to tell us how your project is an art project and not precisely just an advocacy project or an ethnographic project. So everything put together.
Yeah.
Mr. Dayrit.
Thank you.
Mr. Dayrit.
Thank you, Adelaide. So yes, this is a lot of things in one. I wouldn't exactly say it's an ethnographic since I am not an ethnographer. I'm a visual artist, I'm a contemporary artist, and what does this mean? I work within the context of contemporary art, and what does this mean? And who is my audience? Who is my reader? Who is my viewer? And where am I playing this game at? So it talks about a lot of things given the platform, starting with the platform, me showing contemporary art, and whatever this means, in museums and galleries, and in this case, the residency project. And this is my first residency as a visual artist. I know what a residency is, but then this is a little bit unorthodox, I would say, because it extended up to 8 months in residency. Since I am a Filipino, I go back and forth into Bataan. And then earlier on in my residency, I have decided to do a project, for now, for lack of a better term, to discuss the local history and culture and contemporary struggles of the Aitas in Bataan. And before I thought of particularly the Aitas of Bataan, I was consciously looking for a narrative to work on within my residency. In my initial visits to Bataan, I had noticed that all there is to talk about, most of what there is to talk about in terms of the history of Bataan is the Bataan Death March and the Japanese occupation in World War II. And I was consciously looking for an alternative narrative to focus on and work on and articulate within my own artistic practice. So in terms of connectedness, if that is the question, I am never going to be an Aita. I will always be an unat contemporary artist. And this is one of the main things that I had to explain to them. What is contemporary art and what is me as an unat contemporary artist? What do I have to, what can I put on their table? Because like I said, I never wanted to speak for them, but I always, but I wanted to speak to them. Because I wanted to be the mediator so that they could convey their narratives, their histories, their culture into the platform of an exhibition. So this is what I weave as an artist, pseudo-ethnographer, historian, researcher, activist, whatnot. Me crash coursing on a lot of different methodologies, trying to push the envelope on what the exhibitionary could become. And the engagement does not end with this exhibition. Ideally, this exhibition goes back to the community as an initial content to a museum or resource center and library that would precisely help them to articulate their consciousness. And this is something very important that we constantly talk about, me and the representatives of the Aita communities, is this consciousness or the kamalayan. And then when I was talking to them about this idea of consciousness or kamalayan, we would initially address it as Kamalayang Aita, but then eventually it organically was re-articulated into the term Kamalayang Kulot, curly hair, which they felt a lot more comfortable with for some reason, because it meant a lot, it's a lot more connected and appropriate for their own personal use of terminology. So as far as I'm concerned within my relatively new career in this artistic playground, I'd like for this exhibition to go there and stay there and be managed by them, and I don't really feel the need to be an Aita ever, and I don't really feel the need to go back to Bataan the rest of my life, because I want them to continue the authorship of their own history and representation. I just hope I'm not making any mistakes in terms of appropriation and representation, but then if anything, what does contemporary art mean and how can it actually threaten anyway? So if you can see, like in the timeline, some of the representatives of the Aitas would name drop certain people. Let's see how that goes. Because as much as possible, I'd like them to be really hands-on in terms of articulating their own plights. So in the opening reception and in the next round table discussion, there will be representatives present as well. And then in the next round table discussion, hopefully if everything falls into place, a representative will speak for the communities.
Cian, when you were giving me an explanation of the exhibit, And we had all these very clear ideas of why you stage it that way, why you add the carvings, the tapestry, the geographical maps, and that's one of the things that is always in your art, I noticed. And then the totem pole-like-ish art carvings, which is interesting. If you look at the what's the connect, what you explain. I like the idea that you did not, it was a conscious effort, as you said earlier, that you did not put your explanations and posted it side by side. Then, if that is the direction, then many of your colleagues and curators who try to draw a indigenous articulation of that exhibit, when you transfer it and curate it in Bata, in a space that they choose and they decide for perhaps, then let them do the articulation and write what they think about it, right? And then that would be interesting, right? What do they think of those carvings, and what do they think of your very weird looking sinaraket or yintu, no? And then they'll do a articulation of that. Too bad Marian is really not here. I'm sure she would have said a lot about your approach.
But I think, for coming from a curator's side, an exhibition changes in every context you put it. So in a way, Cian's work will become pretty similar contextually to some of these colonial photographs, in the sense that you were someone who came in and you made an image out of the culture that you encountered. I mean, I think your approach was very different, but it'll be really interesting to see when they have agency over their own depiction, how they decide to put this together. I'll pass the mic to you.
Just a question, because you talked about indigenous articulation of cultural culture, and as archaeologists we always see cultural artifacts, and do we also have that kind of liberty in saying, oh, this is my interpretation of it? We don't. So what's the difference between art now and archaeological cultural materials?
Well, the beauty of an artwork or an art exhibit, they have that freedom.
And have someone to defend it.
And the artist is actually also free to change his mind or her mind. And that's but we also are free to change our mind depending on the...
But you're the creator and the curator. You have who owns it. So that's
ownership is different. That's true.
So that's...
in fact, that is the dilemma we have now. And it's something that another kind that you always, both of you have really underscored. And in the realm of politics, where it is a dialectics between the state and maybe a ruling class, and then indigenous people, right? And then there's in between the question of ownership. Who owns that, right? And of course, in the Spanish period, there's I'm forgetting the name of that victim or law, but it's like us. The state owns the private owner of the land only owns the surface. Everything underneath it is owned by the state. That's a very old doctrine that is carried over in the current stage. And so that becomes a problem, right? But the NCIP law, regarding, but the NCIP law goes against it, right? In the NCIP law, an indigenous, ancestral domain owns everything, even though everything underneath. So it goes there. But for the majority of landowners that are not indigenous minority, from the indigenous minority who don't have ancestral land claims, the Regalan law states. Now, the problem of thinking also that it is just one way, that for example, the example of deliberately trying to crush or destroy the old cultures of, let's say, Aboriginal Australians, American Indians, with all the efforts, what will come out is still a kind of a uniqueness of communities that came from those ancestral communities that were at attempted to be destroyed by a powerful state or a highly dominant, aggressive ethnic group. And we have examples of that. You see, the American Indians now are not like the American Indians, or let's say the Apaches now are not the same as Apaches of 100 years ago. But what culture is the same 100 years ago? Every culture transforms. And the wonderful thing about Zambales, in that example, is very good intentioned anthropologists went there also and got some money, and this is their solution to the answer: how will the Amtas compete and survive in the 20th century? If they carry on with their old ways of being nomadic, there's no way that they will survive, and they will be exploited. So what he did, made a foundation, he bought land in the Zambales foothills along Zambales, and called Mangaha 1 and Mangaha 2, and he cajoled, threatened, and sometimes forced Altas to settle. And change their ways and just settle. But a decade after, more than a decade after we excavated the site, a site there, before Betancourt erupted, and the Altas were still coming and going. Like in the old days, right? They were still coming and going. Because they also have agency. Everyone has agency. And it is a question of developing more of that self-worth that brings them some determination, and then a better articulation of their cause. Could you add this to your answer? Ian, do you notice if they still move around?
Okay, because there's no such thing as nomadic. If anything, it's semi-nomadic. And what does semi-nomadic mean? And at the same time, what does land ownership mean? For a lot of indigenous cultures, the idea of ownership of land is absurd. You cannot own land. A family, a few generations, 100 years, 200 years cannot own land because the idea is absurd. But then there is the regalian doctrine. There are colonial laws that dictate what land ownership is. And then like the whole archipelago is titled, if not titled for public land, for public land. And then what does occupying public land mean? So as far as Aitas are concerned, who practice a semi-nomadic lifestyle, they, as far as my research goes, they rely on proclamations that declare their ancestral domain reservations. So here in Bataan, as early as 1920s, there are presidential proclamations declaring certain sites, anything from 60 hectares to 6,000 hectares, ancestral domain, so varying sizes. So if you determine these ancestral domains or reservations, their ancestral domains, wherein they can practice a semi-nomadic lifestyle, this is where they move around, and this is where they harvest forest produce. This is where they, well, unfortunately, sell to other people as well. Because I guess the idea or the responsibility also of owning land is not a very comfortable thing to uphold, especially if you, I don't know how correct this is, but then especially if you are from an indigenous minority, all of a sudden burdened by legal responsibilities of having to manage so-and-so hectares of land, where you never really quantified your land. It's as far as your memory goes, it's as far as you plan. And then Bataan is a relatively small peninsula. So all the Aita communities, one way or another, know each other and have a good understanding on how far they can harvest honey, for example. And then there is an agreement per community within the 18 communities. So going back to me responding to Saysayin or Sitio Magduhat, or where the Not Vital Chapel is, that is also my entry point in integrating with the Aita communities. I hiked up the chapel, which is from the highway about 2.7, 2.8 kilometers. And on the way there, you go through Sitio Magluhan or Saysay community where about 20 plus Aita families live. And then they're not purely Aitas because a lot of the Aita communities here have intermarried into Tagalog and other Bulacan families. So I got to talk to them, and then that's where I found out that where the Nogbital Chapel is part of their ancestral domain. Okay, so what does that mean? And how does this work for them? So they are free to access the perimeter because they don't know exactly the perimeter. It's not exactly being used other than the chapel, which no one really understands other than guests of Las Casas and Bellas Artes, because it is actually a strange thing within the wilderness. A geometric structure which acts like which looks like a religious structure, but then does not necessarily have any religious functions. But every once in a while, the Akuzars and their foreign friends, and that guy who comes, and me who just comes here and there again, frequents. So like as I go on to meet with a representative of the communities and then sort of propose the idea or the proposition of putting the exhibition back into Bataan and back into the Aita communities and having a resource center and museum. It actually started, well, of course, it started as an open-ended, like an idea seed. But then eventually we got into talking about how to actually materialize this idea, because it actually sounds like a good idea. And actually a lot of them are suggesting maybe we can build something in that area. But then we got into talking about this a few weeks back. So like who's gonna build it, who's gonna pay for it, and details like that. So once the idea had been planted, there are a lot of ideas from their side actually. But then, as I always know, like we have to be very, very careful on this. I can imagine a lot of people want their name on this as well, this project, because it sounds nice. It sounds like it's given back. But then, yeah, that's exactly the point why we have to really take it slow. And we can't just say yes to everyone. And we have to, everyone will really have to hear them out. Because we need to, like, the first priority is their agency. Yeah. So, like I said, like I'm really open to the idea of them really articulating what they want, because some of them expressed that it might be a good idea to build something in that area. But for my own personal concern, it also has to be accessible to other Bataan non-Aita communities, because I can imagine a lot of, for example, schools will want to go there as well if it does function as a museum and resource center. So there are a lot of things to talk about in terms of like giving back the land. That idea, I don't know if that's even Jam's call, but then I think, yeah, we can talk about how to go about these intersections of ownership. Because yeah, it is quite a big deal to hear that when you purchase rights or titles to a land, like, oh, that's Lupang Ninuno. And Lupang Ninuno, diba, is a very abstract thing for us who rely on pieces of paper as well, because these pieces of paper are important as well, kasi yung jurisdiction, this is how far you can invest on, this is how far you can play around with, start an organic garden and feel good about yourself. And we all have that, we all have those ideas one way or another. So, how do we recognize the people who have been here for a couple of generations? Or what is time immemorial, diba? What does time immemorial mean? So we really have to move about this very, very, very slowly, and really have to choose who we say yes to. Because we cannot deny the fact that it already started. I cannot abandon this project after this exhibition. It will have to go to, say, Matalangao first, not Saysay. Because there is an existing structure there that was built, donated by a Korean priest, and then for a while functioned as a daycare center, and now it's not functioning, it's abandoned. So based on our previous conversations, that will be a temporary home for this exhibition, which we have to work with. But then in terms of talking about building a structure and having a museum and resource center and having the ITAS actually manage it,
It's a long discussion, and we just started bouncing off ideas on this. Just like also the idea of like managing a museum, and how do you transfer those skills, or what kind of methodology do you employ? And also, which led me to thinking, and this Cian knows very well, like, how big is my scope? Like, our scope in the foundation, like, where should I draw the line that this is not my role, this is someone else's role, or should I increase the scope? Like, I think that's why these discussions are so important. This is not just for show, this is actually like, we're completely exposed in front of you right now, and it's not a comfortable feeling, but I mean, it's good. Like, good to hear what everyone is thinking and what these thoughts are, and because it is admittedly like one big thing that we also talk amongst ourselves in my family as well. Like, parang nasimulan mo na, anong gagawin mo? Like, and this complexity of being a landowner as well, and as you say, like, being subject to all this paperwork and being part of the system when you're dealing with communities that are outside of that system. How do you negotiate, or how do you work with them without exploiting anything or being insensitive? So yeah, I can't tell you right now. Come back to us in a year.
Thank you. I think this is a great moment. We've been here for 2 hours. I'm so impressed with everyone's attention and with the patience of the speakers. So following up with what Jan and Cian said, our next roundtable discussion, which is specifically about the perspectives from professionals working with the ITAS of Bataan, is going to be here, same time on January 8th, so please mark your calendars. And I think this would also be, if you wanted to follow up on that question, this would be a great forum with which to do so. So thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to our speakers, and have a wonderful evening.